Whispers of the Forgotten. Rain lashed against the high-rise windows of Samuel Carter's penthouse, carving restless trails through the foggy glass. The room behind him was a fortress of luxury. Sleek furniture, bespoke art, and an ever-present hum of unseen technology. Yet Samuel felt untethered, like a man floating through a life he no longer recognized. Manhattan stretched below him in a tapestry of relentless energy, its pulse a sharp contrast to the numbness gnawing at his chest. Samuel was a man of control, a titan of industry who could bend the world to his will. Yet tonight, a storm raged within him that no wealth or power could quiet. He stared out at the city, watching the headlights snake through rain-slicked streets, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to think of her. Lauren. Her name was a whisper in his mind, a wound that had never truly healed. 19 years ago, she had vanished in a moment of fiery chaos, a bus crash that had left no survivors. He had been forced to live with the unthinkable, drowning himself in ambition to escape the void she had left behind. But the grief had never truly left him. It had become a shadow, haunting every success, mocking every smile. Samuel turned away from the window, his reflection, a stranger in the glass. He downed his whiskey in one sharp motion, the amber liquid burning as it went down. Tonight, something felt different, a restlessness that clawed at his carefully constructed composure. The rain, the city, the memory of Lauren, it was all too much. He needed to get out, to escape the suffocating walls of his own mind. Grabbing his coat, Samuel stepped into the elevator and descended into the city's depths. His driver, ever discreet, opened the door for him as he entered the car. "Take me somewhere off the grid," Samuel said, his voice low but firm. "Somewhere different." The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, hesitating before nodding. They weaved through the labyrinth of Manhattan, the familiar gleam of polished skyscrapers giving way to the rougher edges of the city's outskirts. Here, the streets were cracked and narrow, the glow of neon signs competing with the dim light of street lamps. Finally, the car slowed to a stop. Samuel stepped out onto a rain-soaked sidewalk, his polished shoes meeting the uneven pavement. Before him stood a modest diner, its sign flickering like a ghost of better days. The letters spelled out Delilah's Diner in weary red neon. It wasn't the kind of place a man like Samuel Carter would normally be caught dead in, but tonight it called to him. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, the sound surprisingly comforting. The diner was a snapshot of the ordinary: worn red booths, laminated menus, and a jukebox that looked like it hadn't worked in years. The smell of coffee and frying bacon hung in the air, grounding in its simplicity. Samuel slid into a corner booth, feeling strangely at ease for the first time in weeks. A waitress approached, balancing a coffee pot in one hand and a menu in the other. She wasn't remarkable at first glance, just a woman in her mid-30s with tired eyes and a warm smile. But as she stepped closer, Samuel froze. Her face. The coffee pot trembled slightly in her hand as she reached his table, her smile faltering under his intense gaze. Samuel's breath hitched, his heart pounding in his chest. She looked exactly like Lauren, so much so that it felt like a cruel hallucination. Every detail was the same: the curve of her jaw, the way her hair fell over her shoulders, even the faint dimple in her cheek when she smiled. "Can I get you anything?" she asked, her voice soft and steady, though there was a hint of unease in her tone. Samuel struggled to find his words. "Just coffee. Black," he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, pouring the steaming liquid into his cup before retreating to the counter. Samuel stared after her, his mind a whirlwind. It wasn't possible. Lauren was dead. He had seen the wreckage, attended the funeral. He had spent 19 years mourning her loss. Yet here she was, or someone who looked so much like her it defied reason. He watched her as she moved about the diner, her motions unhurried but purposeful. It wasn't just her face. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear, The way she smiled politely at customers. It was all painfully familiar. Samuel's mind raced with questions. If this woman wasn't Lauren, then who was she? And if she was Lauren, how had she survived? Why hadn't she come back to him? The bell jingled again, and Samuel barely noticed the new customer entering the diner. His attention was fixed on the waitress as she disappeared into the kitchen. A wave of determination washed over him. He couldn't leave without speaking to her, without finding out the truth. When she returned, he waved her over, his hands trembling slightly. "I'm sorry," he began, his voice tight with emotion. "You remind me of someone. Someone I lost a long time ago." She tilted her head, her brow furrowing slightly. "I get that sometimes," she said with a small smile. "I must have one of those faces." Samuel leaned forward, searching her eyes for any glimmer of recognition. "Do you know anyone named Lauren? Lauren Whitman?" The question hung in the air like a fragile thread. For a moment, her expression flickered, something unreadable crossing her features. But then she shook her head. "No," she said simply. "I don't think so." Samuel's heart sank, but he wasn't convinced. There was something in her eyes, something that hinted at a truth she might not even know herself. Before he could press further, the door opened again, and a man stepped inside. Samuel stiffened. The newcomer was older, his face weathered but sharp. There was something about him that set Samuel's nerves on edge, something familiar. The man exchanged a brief glance with the waitress, his expression unreadable, before taking a seat at the counter. Samuel's instincts flared. This wasn't just a coincidence. The waitress, Lauren, or whoever she was, returned to Samuel's table to clear his empty cup. He seized the opportunity. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice steady but urgent. She hesitated, her hands pausing mid-motion. "Emily," she said finally. "Emily Foster." The name felt wrong, like a mask hiding something deeper. Samuel nodded, masking his frustration. "It was nice to meet you, Emily." As she walked away, his gaze shifted to the man at the counter. Samuel's pulse quickened. He recognized him now, one of Thomas Whitman's men. Thomas, Lauren's father, had always been a shadowy figure, a man of immense power and questionable morals. What was one of his associates doing here, in this out-of-the-way diner? And why was he watching Emily? Samuel's mind raced as he left the diner, the rain soaking through his coat. The woman he had seen, the woman who called herself Emily, was more than a coincidence. Whether she was Lauren or not, she was connected to his past, and to Thomas Whitman. He climbed into his car, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The city loomed around him, its lights harsh and unrelenting. He had spent 19 years burying the pain of Lauren's loss, but now the past was clawing its way back to the surface. Samuel's jaw tightened with resolve. He didn't know what game he had just stepped into, but he wasn't going to let it go. He had built his empire by uncovering secrets, and this time was no different. If Lauren, or Emily, was alive, he would find out why she had vanished, and why she didn't remember him. For the first time in years, Samuel felt a spark of something other than grief. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was something close, a flicker of life in the darkness. He was going to find the truth, no matter the cost. Fractured shadows. The sound of raindrops tapping against the window was all Samuel Carter could hear as he stared at the photograph in his hand. It was an old picture, faded at the edges but still vibrant with the memory it carried. Lauren Whitman, her smile radiant, standing in a sunlit garden. The image felt heavier now, weighted by the events of the previous night. Emily Foster, that was the name she had given him. But Samuel's heart refused to accept it. Her face, her voice, even the way she moved. It all screamed of Lauren. And yet, she had looked at him with the blank gaze of a stranger. Was it possible for someone to forget a life, a love, so entirely? Or was this something far more sinister? His phone vibrated, pulling him from his thoughts. Samuel picked it up, noting the name on the screen. "Elliot. What do you have for me?" Samuel asked, skipping any pleasantries. The private investigator's voice was clipped, his tone carrying a weight that made Samuel sit up straighter. This Emily Foster doesn't exist. Not before 7 years ago, anyway. Samuel's brow furrowed. What do you mean? There's nothing on her. No birth certificate, no school records, no trace of her existence before that time. It's like she just appeared. Samuel gripped the phone tighter. And Whitman? What about him? That's where it gets interesting, Elliot continued. One of his shell companies is tied to a private clinic upstate, specializes in experimental therapies, memory manipulation, to be specific. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Memory manipulation. Samuel's mind raced. Could that explain the blank look in Emily's eyes, the way she seemed to genuinely believe she wasn't Lauren? If so, what kind of monstrous game was Thomas Whitman playing? Send me everything you have, Samuel said, his voice hard. And keep digging. After ending the call, Samuel sat in silence, the weight of the revelations pressing down on him. The Lauren he had loved might still be alive, but if her memories had been stolen from her, was she even the same person? That evening, Samuel found himself once again parked outside Delilah's diner. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and gleaming under the city's neon lights. He had no plan, no clear idea of what he hoped to accomplish, but he couldn't stay away. Inside, the diner was quieter than before, the hum of conversation subdued. Emily was there, moving between tables with practiced ease. She looked tired, her smile softer but strained, as though the weight of her life pressed against the edges of her consciousness. Samuel waited until she approached his table, her notepad ready. Back again? She asked, her tone light but guarded. Samuel nodded. I couldn't stay away. The coffee's too good. She smirked faintly, but her eyes were wary. Same as before. Actually, he said, leaning forward slightly, I was hoping we could talk. Off the record. Emily frowned, glancing around the diner. I'm working. It's important, Samuel pressed, his voice low. Please, just a few minutes. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the notepad. Finally, she sighed. Fine, but it'll have to wait until my shift ends. Samuel nodded, relief washing over him. He watched her for the next hour, noting the way she interacted with the other customers. Her warmth, her quiet attentiveness. It was all so familiar, so achingly Lauren. He couldn't reconcile the two halves of his reality. The woman he had loved and the stranger she had become. When the last customer left and the staff began to close up, Emily approached him, her coat draped over one arm. All right, she said. You've got my attention. What's so important? Samuel gestured toward the door. Can we go somewhere more private? She hesitated, her expression guarded. I don't know you. I understand, Samuel said, his tone sincere. But I promise, I'm not here to hurt you. I just need to understand something. After a long pause, she nodded. There's a park a few blocks from here. We can talk there. The park was quiet, its paths slick with rain. They sat on a bench beneath a street lamp, the glow casting soft shadows across their faces. Emily wrapped her coat tightly around herself, her breath visible in the cool night air. So, she said, her tone edged with impatience. What's this about? Samuel took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. You remind me of someone I lost. Her name was Lauren Whitman. We were close. She died in a bus accident 19 years ago. Emily stiffened, her eyes narrowing. What does that have to do with me? Samuel reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph, holding it out to her. Look at this. She took the photo reluctantly, her fingers brushing against the edges. Her eyes widened as she stared at the image, her lips parting in a soft gasp. That's... She trailed off, her voice trembling. That's impossible. Samuel leaned forward, his gaze intent. It's you, Emily. Or it was. I don't know what happened, but I believe you're Lauren. Emily shook her head, her grip on the photograph tightening. No, I've never seen this before. I don't know this woman. Think about it, Samuel urged. Do you remember anything from before 7 years ago? Anything at all? She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it, her brow furrowing. I don't. Her voice faltered. There are flashes, images, but they don't make sense. They don't feel real. Samuel's heart pounded. That's because someone erased your memories. There's a clinic upstate, tied to Thomas Whitman. They specialize in memory therapy, experimental treatments. I think you were taken there. Emily stared at him, her expression a mix of fear and disbelief. Why would someone do that? Why would someone take my life away? I don't know, Samuel admitted, but I'm going to find out. I promise. She looked down at the photograph again, her hands trembling. If what you're saying is true, then I don't even know who I am. Samuel placed a hand over hers, his touch gentle but firm. You're Lauren. You're the woman I loved. And we're going to get to the bottom of this, together. As they left the park, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them. Samuel glanced over his shoulder, his body tensing. A man stood in the shadows, watching them. His face was obscured, but Samuel recognized his stance, the same man who had entered the diner the night before. We're not alone, Samuel murmured to Emily, his voice low. Stay close. The man began to approach, his movements deliberate. Samuel stepped in front of Emily, his protective instincts flaring. Who are you? Samuel called out. What do you want? The man stopped a few feet away, his expression cold. You don't know what you're playing with, Carter, he said, his voice sharp. Walk away. This isn't your fight. Samuel's jaw tightened. If this is about Lauren, it's my fight. The man smirked, his eyes narrowing. Lauren Whitman is gone. Whoever she is now, she's not yours to save. Before Samuel could respond, the man turned and disappeared into the darkness. Samuel's fists clenched, anger and frustration surging through him. We need to get somewhere safe, he said, turning to Emily. This is bigger than I thought. Emily nodded, her expression pale but determined. I'm trusting you, she said softly. But if you're wrong, I'm not, Samuel said, his voice steady. We'll find the truth, whatever it takes. Shards of the truth, the hum of the engine filled the silence between them as Samuel Carter drove through the dimly lit streets, his focus split between the road ahead and the woman beside him. Emily, or Lauren, as he was now certain she was, stared blankly out the window, her fingers absently tracing the edge of the photograph in her lap. The tension in the car was palpable, the air heavy with questions neither of them dared to ask aloud. They were being followed. Samuel could feel it. In his rearview mirror, headlights hovered at a steady distance, their persistence unnerving. It wasn't the first time he'd sensed it since leaving the park. Whoever the man was who had confronted them, he wasn't working alone. We can't go back to the diner, Samuel said, breaking the silence. His voice was firm, but not unkind. It's not safe. Emily turned to him, her eyes wide with uncertainty. Then where are we going? Somewhere they won't find us, Samuel replied, his mind racing through his options. The safe house he'd kept for years, tucked away in the heart of the city, seemed like the only viable choice. I'll explain everything once we're secure. Her grip on the photograph tightened, her knuckles white. I don't even know what's happening, she whispered, her voice trembling. This feels like a nightmare. Samuel glanced at her, his expression softening. I know it's overwhelming, but you're not alone in this. Whatever they've done to you, we'll uncover the truth. Emily's eyes searched his face, as if looking for reassurance. She nodded, though the fear in her gaze remained. The safe house was unassuming, hidden in the middle of an unremarkable apartment complex. Samuel had purchased it years ago, a precautionary measure during a particularly volatile business deal. Now, it served as a sanctuary. As they entered, Emily hesitated in the doorway, her eyes scanning the sparse room. The walls were bare, the furniture minimal, A single couch, a coffee table, and a desk with a computer in the corner. It was the kind of place designed to be forgotten. "You live here?" she asked, her voice laced with skepticism. Samuel shook his head. "No, this is just a backup for situations like this." Emily sat cautiously on the edge of the couch, clutching the photograph like a lifeline. Samuel watched her for a moment, then moved to the desk, pulling out his laptop. He opened the files Elliot had sent earlier, scanning the information with practiced precision. "There's a facility upstate," he began, his tone measured. "A private clinic. They specialize in experimental treatments, specifically memory manipulation." Elliot traced some of the funding to Whitman's companies. Emily looked up, her brow furrowing. "Memory manipulation. That's not possible." "It is," Samuel said grimly. "And I think that's what they did to you. They erased your past, gave you a new identity." She shook her head, her voice rising with panic. "No, that doesn't make sense. I'm not this Lauren person. I've never heard of her." Samuel stood and moved closer, kneeling in front of her. "Think about it, Emily. What do you remember before 7 years ago? Anything at all?" Her lips parted, but no words came. She stared at him, her expression a mixture of confusion and fear. I don't know. I've always thought it was just a blank spot. A trauma I couldn't remember." "That's because it's not a blank spot," Samuel said gently. "It's a wall, something they put there to keep you from remembering." Emily's hands trembled as she pressed them to her temples. "But why? Why would someone do that to me?" "That's what we need to find out," Samuel said, his voice steady. "But I think it has everything to do with your father." Emily's eyes snapped to his, a spark of recognition flickering. "My father?" "Thomas Whitman," Samuel said. "He's involved in this. I don't know why, but I know he's behind it." Emily stood abruptly, pacing the small room. "You keep saying I'm this Lauren person, but I don't feel like her. I don't know who she is." "Because they took her from you," Samuel said. "They took everything. But they couldn't erase who you are, not completely. I see it, Emily. I see her in you." Her pacing slowed, her shoulders slumping. "If what you're saying is true, then I don't even know myself." Samuel approached her, his tone soft. "Then let's find out. Together." The following morning, Samuel received a call from Elliot. His voice was tense, the urgency clear. "I've got more on that clinic," Elliot said. "It's worse than we thought." "What do you mean?" Samuel asked, his stomach tightening. "Their records mention a project, Oblivion. It wasn't just about erasing memories. It was about creating new ones. They didn't just erase her past. They gave her a different one." Samuel's blood ran cold. "What kind of memories?" "I don't know," Elliot admitted. "The files are heavily encrypted. But there's something else. The clinic had references to a phase 2. Whatever they did to her, they weren't finished." Samuel glanced at Emily, who was sitting at the table, staring out the window. "Do you think they'll come after her?" "They already are," Elliot said. "You need to keep moving. They won't stop until they get her back." The weight of Elliot's words hung heavy over them as Samuel and Emily prepared to leave. Samuel packed what little he could carry, his mind racing with strategies and contingencies. Emily remained quiet, her expression distant. "Are you okay?" Samuel asked, his voice gentle. She nodded, though her eyes betrayed her fear. "I'm just trying to process all of this." Samuel placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch steadying. "We'll get through this. I promise." They left the safe house under the cover of darkness, Samuel driving with deliberate care. The city felt different now, its familiar streets laced with danger. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every passing car a potential enemy. As they drove, Emily broke the silence. "If they gave me a new past, what happens if I don't like what I find?" Samuel glanced at her, his gaze unwavering. "Then we'll face it together. Whatever it is." Hours later, they arrived at the edge of a sprawling forest. Hidden deep within the trees was the clinic, a modern structure that seemed out of place in the natural surroundings. Its sleek, sterile design exuded an aura of secrecy. "This is it," Samuel said, his voice low. "Are you ready?" Emily nodded, though her hands trembled. "I have to be." They approached cautiously, slipping through the shadows. The building was surrounded by cameras and guards, but Samuel had studied the blueprints Elliot had sent. He led Emily to a side entrance, bypassing the main security. Inside, the clinic was eerily silent, the hum of machinery the only sound. They moved through the hallways, their footsteps muffled by the polished floors. Samuel's heart pounded as they approached a door marked Patient Records. "This is it," he whispered. "Stay close." He picked the lock with practiced ease, the door clicking open. Inside, rows of filing cabinets lined the walls, a computer terminal glowing faintly in the center of the room. Emily hesitated at the threshold, her breathing shallow. Samuel began searching through the files, his hands moving quickly but carefully. He found a folder labeled Foster, Emily, and handed it to her. "This is you," he said. Emily opened the folder, her eyes scanning the documents. Her face paled as she read, her hands shaking. "What does it say?" Samuel asked. They did things to me," she whispered. "Therapies, treatments. They erased everything. They made me someone else." Samuel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll make them pay for this. But first, we need to get out of here." As they turned to leave, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Samuel's heart raced as he pushed Emily behind a row of cabinets. "Stay quiet," he whispered. The door opened, and 2 guards stepped inside, their flashlights sweeping the room. Samuel held his breath, his mind racing with escape plans. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Secrets beneath the surface. The faint glow of the computer monitor cast eerie shadows across the room as Samuel and Emily crouched behind the row of filing cabinets. The guards' footsteps echoed off the sterile walls, their flashlights slicing through the darkness in sharp beams. Samuel's pulse quickened, his mind working overtime to calculate their next move. Emily's breath was shallow, her body trembling beside him. He placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, his touch firm but silent. She nodded, understanding his unspoken reassurance. One of the guards approached the cabinets, his flashlight sweeping closer. Samuel reached for the letter opener he had slipped into his pocket earlier, a makeshift weapon, but better than nothing. The light danced just inches from their hiding spot when the other guard called out, "Let's move." "Nothing here." The beam of light receded, and Samuel exhaled softly as the guard's footsteps grew fainter. He waited until the door clicked shut before turning to Emily. "We need to go now," he whispered. Emily clutched the folder containing the fragments of her stolen life, her knuckles white. "Where?" Samuel's jaw tightened. "Out. We'll regroup and figure out our next step. But we can't stay here." They slipped through the hallways like shadows, moving swiftly but cautiously. Samuel's knowledge of the clinic's layout, thanks to Elliot's blueprints, proved invaluable. He led Emily down a service corridor that bypassed the main security checkpoints. As they reached the exit, a faint sound stopped them in their tracks, a muffled cry, barely audible but unmistakable. Emily froze, her gaze darting toward a nearby door. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Samuel hesitated. "We can't risk it. We need to keep moving." But Emily was already moving toward the door, her hand trembling as she pushed it open. The room beyond was dimly lit, filled with medical equipment and a single hospital bed. A young man, no older than 20, was strapped to the bed, his face pale and gaunt. Electrodes were attached to his temples, wires snaking to a machine that emitted a soft hum. "Help!" the man croaked, his voice weak. Emily's eyes widened. What are they doing to him? Samuel stepped inside, his gaze sweeping the room. "It looks like memory suppression. He's part of the same program." The man's eyes flickered open, desperation evident in his gaze. "Please, they'll come back." Samuel hesitated, torn between the urgency of their escape and the moral weight of leaving the man behind. Finally, he pulled a pair of surgical scissors from a nearby tray and began cutting the straps binding the man's wrists. Emily helped, her movements frantic but determined. "What's your name?" she asked softly. "Ryan," the man whispered. "Ryan Mercer." The name jolted Samuel, his mind flashing to the files Elliot had sent. The Ryan Foundation. The name wasn't a coincidence. "We have to move," Samuel said, his voice firm. "Can you walk?" Ryan nodded weakly, his legs shaky as Emily helped him to his feet. Together, the three of them slipped back into the corridor. The night air was a stark contrast to the clinic's sterile chill. The forest surrounding the facility was dense and dark, the rustling of leaves masking their hurried footsteps. Samuel led the way, his instincts sharp, while Emily and Ryan followed closely behind. They reached Samuel's car, parked in a secluded spot off the main road. Samuel helped Ryan into the backseat before sliding into the driver's seat. Emily climbed into the passenger side, glancing nervously at the forest. "Do you think they'll follow us?" she asked. "They'll know we've been there," Samuel replied, starting the engine. "But we have a head start." The drive back to the city was tense, the silence in the car broken only by Ryan's labored breathing. Emily kept glancing at him, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "What happened to you?" she finally asked. Ryan's gaze was distant, his voice barely above a whisper. "They took me, years ago, told me they'd help me forget. But it wasn't forgetting, it was erasing. They turned me into someone else." Emily's hands tightened in her lap. "Someone else." Ryan's eyes met hers, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "They took your life too, didn't they?" Emily nodded, her throat tightening. "I think so, but I don't know why." Samuel's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "We'll figure it out. Whatever they're hiding, we'll uncover it." Back at the safe house, Samuel helped Ryan to the couch, while Emily fetched a glass of water. The young man looked fragile, his hands trembling as he sipped the water Emily offered him. "I overheard them," Ryan said, his voice rasping. "Before they started the treatments, they were talking about a project, Oblivion." Samuel exchanged a glance with Emily. "We've seen references to it," he said. "What do you know about it?" Ryan shook his head. "Not much. But it's not just about erasing memories. It's about control. They want to create people they can use, people without a past, without connections. They can make you whoever they want you to be." Emily sank into a chair, her face pale. "Why me? Why did they take me?" "I don't know," Ryan admitted. "But they chose you for a reason. Everyone they take. It's not random." Samuel's mind raced. The more they uncovered, the more sinister the picture became. This wasn't just about Lauren. It was about something larger, a conspiracy that stretched far beyond their understanding. The next morning, Samuel contacted Elliot, relaying everything they had learned. Elliot's response was grim. "This goes deep," Elliot said. "Whitman's been funding these experiments for years. But here's the kicker. I found a connection between the clinic and the Ryan Foundation. It's a front. They're using it to funnel money into these projects." Samuel's jaw tightened. "What's Whitman's endgame?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Elliot said. "But there's something else. There's a phase 2. Whatever they've done so far, it's just the beginning." Samuel glanced at Emily and Ryan, both of whom were listening intently. "We need to stop them," he said, "whatever it takes." Elliot's voice was cautious. "Be careful, Carter. You're playing a dangerous game. Whitman doesn't leave loose ends." "Neither do I," Samuel replied, ending the call. That night, as Samuel sat by the window, staring out at the city, Emily joined him. She looked exhausted, her face pale but resolute. "Do you think I'll ever remember who I was?" she asked softly. Samuel turned to her, his expression gentle. "I don't know. But I do know this. You're more than what they tried to make you. You're still you, even if they tried to take that away." Emily's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "What if I don't like the person I was?" Samuel placed a hand on hers, his voice steady. "Then we'll figure it out together. You're not alone in this." For the first time in days, Emily allowed herself to relax, leaning into his shoulder. The fight wasn't over, but in that moment, they found solace in the shared hope of uncovering the truth. The edge of the abyss. The faint hum of the city was a constant backdrop as the group regrouped at the safe house. Samuel Carter stood near the window, his posture rigid, his mind running through every angle of their predicament. Outside, the rain had returned, a steady drizzle obscuring the flickering lights of New York. Behind him, Emily Foster, Lauren Whitman, sat cross-legged on the couch, her gaze fixed on the photo in her lap. Ryan Mercer rested nearby, his pallor improved, but his eyes heavy with the weight of too many stolen years. Samuel turned, his voice cutting through the silence. "We have to make a move. Waiting here only gives them more time to regroup." Emily looked up, her brow furrowed. "And go where? What do we even do next? Every step we take feels like walking into a trap." Ryan's voice was hoarse but steady as he spoke. "The clinic isn't their only facility. When I was there, I overheard mentions of another location. The place where they perfect the process." Samuel's interest piqued. "Where?" Ryan hesitated, as if dredging up the memory took a physical toll. "Upstate, near a place called Clearwater Falls. It's remote, hard to access." Samuel pulled out his phone, quickly searching for any leads on the area. The screen illuminated his furrowed brow as he scanned the results. "There's nothing obvious. No listed businesses, no infrastructure that matches what you're describing." "Exactly," Ryan said. "They wouldn't put this in plain sight. They'd buried it, just like they buried the lives they stole." Emily leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "If we go there, we could finally get answers. But what if it's a trap? What if they're waiting for us?" "They are," Samuel said bluntly, his tone unyielding. "But waiting here won't make us any safer. At least there, we can take the fight to them." Emily looked into his eyes, searching for certainty. "Then we go." The journey to Clearwater Falls was long and fraught with tension. Samuel drove, his grip on the wheel firm, as the highway stretched endlessly before them. Emily sat in the passenger seat, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. In the back seat, Ryan dozed fitfully, his breathing uneven. The farther they traveled, the more desolate the landscape became. The bustling energy of New York gave way to rolling hills and thick forests, the isolation pressing against them like a heavy blanket. By the time they reached the outskirts of Clearwater Falls, night had fallen, and the dense canopy of trees cast deep shadows over the narrow road. "There," Ryan said suddenly, pointing toward a faint glow in the distance. "That's it." Samuel slowed the car, pulling off the road and into the cover of the trees. The glow resolved into a compound surrounded by high fences, its perimeter patrolled by armed guards. The stark, modern architecture of the building stood in sharp contrast to the natural beauty around it, a testament to the secrets it held. "We can't just walk in," Emily whispered. "They'll see us coming." Samuel nodded, his mind working quickly. "We need a distraction. Something to draw their attention away from the main entrance." Ryan spoke up, his voice firmer than before. "There's a service road on the north side. It's where they bring in supplies. If we can block it, they'll send guards to investigate." Samuel glanced at him, surprised by his clarity. "Are you sure?" Ryan met his gaze, determination hardening his features. "They took everything from me. I'm not sitting on the sidelines anymore." Under the cover of darkness, they set their plan into motion. Samuel parked the car a safe distance away, and the three of them moved through the forest, their steps muffled by the damp earth. Ryan led them to the service road, pointing out a small supply truck parked near the gate. "We can use that," Ryan said. "If we disable it here, they'll have to send someone to check." Samuel nodded, pulling out the toolkit he had packed. "Emily, keep watch. Ryan, help me with this." They worked quickly, disabling the truck's engine and slashing its tires. As expected, a commotion soon erupted from the compound. Guards emerged, their flashlights cutting through the trees as they approached the disabled vehicle. "Move," Samuel whispered, motioning for Emily and Ryan to follow him. They slipped through the fence on the compound's eastern side, using the shadows to mask their movements. The building loomed before them, its steel and glass facade gleaming ominously in the faint moonlight. Inside, the air was sterile and cold, the silence broken only by the faint hum of machinery. Samuel led the way, his steps careful but purposeful. Emily followed closely, her heart pounding in her chest. Ryan brought up the rear, his eyes scanning every corner. They reached a central corridor, its walls lined with locked doors. Samuel paused, his instincts warning him that they were walking into the lion's den. "This is it," Ryan said, his voice tight. "The heart of it all." Samuel tried the nearest door, but it was locked. He knelt, pulling out a small lock-picking set. Within moments, the door clicked open, revealing a room filled with monitors and filing cabinets. Emily stepped inside, her breath catching as she took in the sight. The monitors displayed footage of patients strapped to chairs, their faces blank as doctors administered treatments. On one screen, a familiar face appeared, her own. "That's me," she whispered, her voice shaking. Samuel placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure this out. Look for anything we can take, files, footage, anything." They worked quickly, rifling through the cabinets and copying data from the computers onto a portable drive. The more they uncovered, the darker the truth became. The clinic wasn't just erasing memories. It was rewriting them, turning its patients into blank slates for manipulation. Emily found a file labeled Project Oblivion. Phase 2. She opened it, her hands trembling as she read. "They were planning to reintroduce me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "to society. As someone else. Someone they could control." Samuel's jaw tightened, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "Not if we stop them." A sudden noise in the hallway made them freeze. Footsteps, steady and deliberate, approached the room. Samuel motioned for Emily and Ryan to hide, positioning himself near the door. The handle turned, and a man stepped inside. Samuel reacted instantly, grabbing the intruder and slamming him against the wall. The man struggled, but Samuel's grip was unyielding. "Who are you?" Samuel demanded, his voice low and dangerous. The man smirked, his gaze cold. "You can't stop this, Carter. You're too late." Samuel's grip tightened. "Why Lauren? Why Emily? What does Whitman want?" The man's smirk faltered, but he didn't answer. Before Samuel could press further, the sound of alarms blared through the compound. "They know we're here," Ryan said, his voice urgent. Samuel released the man, who slumped to the floor, unconscious. He turned to Emily and Ryan. "We need to go. Now." They fled through the corridors, the alarms ringing in their ears. Guards appeared at every turn, their shouts echoing through the building. Samuel led Emily and Ryan with precision, his mind focused on one goal: escape. They reached the fence just as searchlights swept the forest. Samuel boosted Emily over first, then helped Ryan. As he climbed, a shout rang out behind him. "Stop!" Samuel didn't hesitate. He dropped to the other side of the fence, landing hard but steady. The three of them sprinted through the forest, the sound of pursuit close behind. When they finally reached the car, Samuel started the engine, his hands steady despite the chaos. They sped away, leaving the compound and its secrets behind. As the forest gave way to open roads, Emily looked at him, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. "What now?" she asked. Samuel glanced at her, his jaw set. We exposed them. Whitman, the clinic, everything. They've hidden in the shadows long enough. Emily nodded, her gaze steely. Then let's finish this. The reckoning. The sun was just beginning to rise over Manhattan when Samuel Carter pulled the car into the underground garage of a nondescript building. The faint hum of the city was muffled by the thick concrete walls, but the tension inside the car was palpable. Samuel turned off the engine and sat in silence for a moment, his hand still gripping the steering wheel. Emily sat in the passenger seat, her gaze distant. The events of the night before lingered in the tightness of her shoulders and the tremor in her hands. In the back seat, Ryan Mercer leaned against the door, his exhaustion etched into every line of his face. Samuel finally broke the silence. We can't run anymore. If we want to stop this, we have to hit them where it hurts. Emily turned to him, her eyes sharp despite the weariness. You mean Whitman? Samuel nodded. Whitman is the key to all of this. The clinic, the experiments, Project Oblivion. It all leads back to him. If we expose him, we can end this. Ryan's voice was hoarse but steady. And how do we do that? He's untouchable. Not anymore, Samuel said, his tone resolute. We have the files. We have the footage, and I know someone who can help us make it public. Emily's brow furrowed. Who? Samuel hesitated, then glanced at her. An investigative journalist. Her name is Claire Daniels. She's relentless, and she doesn't scare easily. If anyone can get this story out, it's her. Emily nodded slowly. Then let's do it. The meeting. Samuel arranged the meeting for later that day in a discreet office space he rented under a false name. Claire Daniels arrived precisely on time, her sharp features and confident stride exuding the no-nonsense attitude that had made her a respected journalist. She wore a tailored blazer, her notebook tucked under one arm, and her piercing gaze immediately scanned the room. Samuel Carter, she said, extending a hand. It's been a while. Samuel shook her hand. Claire, thanks for coming. She glanced at Emily and Ryan, her journalistic instincts already piecing together their significance. And who are they? They're the story, Samuel said simply. Sit down, and I'll explain. Over the next hour, Samuel laid everything out. The clinic, the experiments, the stolen identities, and the connection to Thomas Whitman. Emily shared her experiences, her voice trembling but steady as she recounted the fragments of her stolen life. Ryan added his own harrowing tale, his words painting a chilling picture of the lengths the organization had gone to in their pursuit of control. Claire listened intently, her pen flying across the pages of her notebook. When they finished, she leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. This is massive, she finally said. If what you're saying is true, this could be the story of the decade. But you realize the risk, right? Whitman won't go down without a fight. Samuel's gaze hardened. I've faced bigger threats. This time, it's personal. Claire nodded. Then let's make it count. The plan. Over the next 24 hours, Claire worked tirelessly, corroborating their story with the files and footage Samuel had provided. Her contacts in the media world began quietly assembling the pieces, preparing for a coordinated release that would expose Whitman and his network in one devastating blow. Meanwhile, Samuel, Emily, and Ryan stayed on the move, knowing Whitman's men were likely searching for them. Every shadow felt like a threat, every passerby a potential spy. We need to stay ahead of them, Samuel said as they packed their belongings at a temporary safe house. Once this goes public, they'll lose their leverage. But until then, we're targets. Emily looked at him, her voice soft but firm. I'm ready for this. I don't care what it takes. I just want my life back. Samuel's gaze softened. You'll get it. I promise. The fallout. The story broke at dawn, plastered across every major news outlet. Headlines screamed of Thomas Whitman's secret experiments, the clinic's unethical practices, and the countless lives that had been erased and rewritten under the guise of therapy. The footage of Emily and Ryan in the clinic was broadcast nationwide, their faces now symbols of resilience against Whitman's corruption. The fallout was immediate and explosive. Whitman's empire, once untouchable, began to crumble under the weight of public outrage and legal scrutiny. Protests erupted outside his corporate headquarters, demanding justice for the victims of his experiments. But Whitman himself remained elusive. Despite the mounting evidence against him, he had yet to be apprehended, his influence still protecting him from the full force of the law. The confrontation. It was 2 days after the story broke when Samuel received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end was familiar, cold, and calculating. "Carter," Thomas Whitman said, his tone dripping with disdain. "You've made quite the mess." Samuel's jaw tightened. "The only mess is the one you created, Whitman. It's over." Whitman chuckled darkly. "You think a few headlines will bring me down. You don't understand the game you're playing." "I understand it better than you think," Samuel shot back. "And I'm not afraid of you." Whitman's tone grew sharper. "You should be. You've meddled in something far beyond your comprehension. Walk away now, and maybe I'll let you keep what's left of your life." Samuel's voice was steady, his resolve unshaken. "You've already taken too much. This ends now." The resolution. The confrontation with Whitman marked the final turning point. Samuel, Emily, and Ryan worked with law enforcement and legal teams to ensure the evidence against Whitman was airtight. Within weeks, Whitman was arrested, his carefully constructed empire dismantled piece by piece. Emily began the long process of reclaiming her life. Therapy and support helped her confront the fragments of her past, and though she couldn't recover all her memories, she found solace in the knowledge that she was no longer a pawn in someone else's game. Ryan, too, began to heal, using his experience to advocate for others who had suffered similar fates. Together, they became symbols of resilience, their stories inspiring others to fight for justice. For Samuel, the journey was bittersweet. He had spent nearly 2 decades mourning Lauren, only to find her again under unimaginable circumstances. But in the end, he realized that Emily wasn't the same woman he had lost. And that was okay. She was stronger, braver, and more determined than he could have imagined. As they stood on a rooftop overlooking the city, Emily turned to Samuel, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." Samuel smiled, the weight of the past finally lifting from his shoulders. "You don't have to thank me. You're the one who found yourself again." They stood in silence for a moment, the city bustling below them, a reminder that life went on. For the first time in years, Samuel felt at peace. The echoes of the past had finally faded, replaced by the promise of a brighter future.